Shalom Lekulam. Welcome everybody to the Begin Center Zoom in English, our weekly English program for English speakers in Israel and around the world. I welcome newcomers and veterans of this program. Today we're going to be discussing really the topic that I think is at the top of the news agenda wherever you are in the world, pretty much. Obviously, we're going to be looking at it from an Israeli angle, but there's no doubt that this story, the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fallout around the world is something that I think we can't ignore, not least because it does in fact have significant repercussions for Israel and the wider Middle East. So before I introduce my guest, let me just briefly explain for those that are new to this how this is going to work. I'm going to speak to our guest for about 30-40 minutes, and then we will go to questions from you. You can write those questions whenever you wish into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and I will put some of those questions to our guest. Right. Let me introduce Dr. Sarah-Masha Fainberg, the head of research, senior research fellow and lecturer at Tel Aviv University, and a visiting professor of Israeli affairs at Georgetown University. She previously served as policy and strategic issues advisor at Israel's Ministry of Defense, and was also a research fellow at the prestigious Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, probably Israel's premier think tank. Security think tank, and her expertise is Russia and in particular Russia's policies in this region, the Middle East. So she's the perfect person for us to discuss this topic. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good evening to everyone, or good morning.
Okay, so before we get to Israel and the Middle East, let's take advantage of having you with us, having an expert with us. To get your view on where things stand right now. We've all seen on our television screens or on our computer screens, or we've read what's happening on various news sites. But what's your view of where things stand right now in the conflict, in the invasion of Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Well, good evening to everyone. First of all, I'm speaking tonight as an analyst. But I have to tell you, to all of you, that this topic is extremely emotional. It is extremely emotional for many Russian-speaking folks who have families in Russia and Ukraine, who call to their relatives on a daily basis. And it is difficult to address those topics without the emotional component of this. So I will try to be as cold and analytical as possible, but disclosure, this is an emotional topic for me. Where we are at the moment, I will only talk about the operational tactical level. I think you are all aware of the strategic issues that are involved in the conflict between Russia and the West. And this is a topic that is widely covered about Russia's need to rebuild its great power status vis-a-vis the West, Russia's deep-seated security needs vis-a-vis NATO, and Russia's broader efforts to build an anti-liberal coalition with China, Iran, and other countries. So this is a strategic aspect of this crisis. If we get down to the operational aspect, we are now, Paul, in the second stage of what has been up to now a very bizarre Russian operation. What I mean a Russian war, what I mean by bizarre, what we've seen unfolding in the Ukrainian front lines, especially in the airspace, is very different, very contrasted with Russia's concept of war and with Russia's technological capabilities. So Russia thus far, until yesterday, I would say, has acted in a, I would say, unprofessional, uncoordinated, and bizarre way, which has struck many Russian military experts and analysts. Given Russia's difficulty of launching a siege on Kiev and of advancing an occupation of Ukraine and triggering a regime change, Russia, we can address this in the Q&A question. Russia is transitioning or has transitioned to a second phase. This phase is marked by two elements. The deployment of the nuclear strike threats at the rhetorical level and at the tactical level. And second, the transition to massive bombing, indiscriminate bombing of civilians. So this is where we are at the moment, with failed negotiations and almost no venues for Russia, the West, and Ukraine to exit that crisis. Last but not least, Paul, before we address the Middle East, I have to say that the Middle East is a secondary theater of what is going on, of a crisis that has been completely internationalized. It's a global crisis. It is a crisis that puts the entire world on the verge of a third world war. We are at the stage of a brinkmanship. And the Middle East is on the backstage, and this is what we're going to address tonight.
Okay, just before we do that, I generally don't want to take questions from the audience during our discussion, but just as there was one question which I will put to you from Ben Pashkov, because I think it's important in terms of understanding. When we talk about Russia's security needs, he asks, I think with legitimate surprise, what would be a serious security threat to Russia? And I guess the question is that I'll add on to that. Are we talking about Russia's perception of its security needs? Is there an objective security threat to Russia, or is it simply Putin's perception of Russia's place in Eastern and Central Europe?
Well, I've worked in the field of security for a few years. And there is one thing that I learned, and especially in the Middle East, is that security is all about perception. And you can convince the Israelis from morning to evening that Iran is not a real threat with a JCPOA agreement signed, and still we're going to feel very threatened, okay? And we're going to build up our forces accordingly. Iran, you can convince Iran that Iran is not threatened by the West and by Israel, objectively speaking, but the Iranians will sit and explain to you that Israel does represent a tangible and substantial security threat for Iran. So I would like to speak about Russian perception in the sense that this perception shapes the reality on the ground and creates a dynamic. And Russia, and here I'm not a mouthpiece of the Kremlin, but Russia, in its national security concept, sees the West as attempting to contain it through the deployment of defensive and offensive capabilities on its borders. Just one number that everybody knows, NATO transition, added some 16 countries in the past years. And for Russia, it's been perceived as an aggression and as an objective security threat. And Russia sees Ukraine, and again, I think we shouldn't be judgmental, we should be analytical. And Russia sees Ukraine as a potential platform for expanding, for increasing NATO's threat on Russia. And here, full disclosure, I'm a supporter. I'm very supportive of Ukraine, and in our discussions in Israel with my colleagues in the security realm, I'm an advocate for a stronger support to Ukraine. This is my personal position.
Sure.
But I want to be analytical and objective about Russia's perception.
Okay, thank you. Long-time viewers of this will know that I tend not to put forward my own positions in these things in my role as moderator. But yeah, I'm very willing to say that my own sympathies lie with the country that is being bombarded right now. And I make no apologies for that. Okay, let's get to Israel and the Middle East. Let's start with Israel. There's been, like, I would say, looking at it from the outside, reading reports, there's been an evolution, I guess, in Israel's position, right? So there was that early sort of slightly confused mixed messaging where Foreign Minister Lapid sort of condemned Russia, and then Prime Minister Bennett spoke a bit later and he expressed sympathy for Ukraine, but he didn't mention Russia. And then there were these unconfirmed reports that Israel was reluctant to join a UN resolution condemning Russia, but then in the end it did join that resolution. And there was another resolution today calling on UN General Assembly resolution calling for a ceasefire and Russia to withdraw. And again, Israel joined in supporting that resolution. So how would you explain for us the dilemma facing Israel's leaders and how they've decided to respond over this past week?
Mm-hmm. Israel, the main dilemma that Israel has is extremely simple. Israel posits and sees the United States as the bedrock of its national security. But in a changing Middle East, where there is a perceived feeling and perceived impression of US disengagement from that region. On the other hand, we've seen since 2015 and even before a very active engagement of Russia across the Middle East in the MENA region, with Russia, as all of you knowing this, becoming the direct neighbor of Israel at its northern border. So Russia does have a military presence in Syria, and Russia does have a military presence with far-reaching implications on the IDF's and especially the Israeli Air Force freedom of operations in Syria. So basically what Israel is trying to balance is to keep this sacred relationship with the West and with the United States intact, stainless, but at the same time avoid a rupture of relations with Russia that could backlash seriously against Israel on the Syrian front lines. So this is a strategic dilemma for Israel, with opportunities and challenges on both sides.
What are the opportunities? I mean, the challenges I think are clear, but what would you say are opportunities?
In terms the opportunities in terms of the United States.
Yeah.
If Israel tilts its position and adopts a much clearer position than it does today, for example, transitioning from humanitarian assistance providing country to a country providing a more substantial assistance, as President Zelensky asked from Israel, such as defensive weapons, for example, that could, I think, would be beneficial to Israel in strengthening its relationship with the United States, with the Democratic Party that has suffered in the past years, and especially under the Prime Minister Netanyahu mandate. I think that having Israel very, very clearly siding with the United States, siding with NATO, siding with Europe, but not only at the declarative level or with soft power like humanitarian assistance, I think that could help Israel in the long run. The opportunity side, on the Russian side, having Israel being able to keep this very fine balancing act could position Israel as a very valuable mediator. Maybe not now, but in a few months between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and the West. Remember that since 2014, Israel is the only Western liberal democracy that has kept a tight security cooperation dialogue with Russia. Therefore, Israel is perceived by Russia, but also by the West, and the United States in particular, as a bridge, as a mediator in times of crisis with Russia. So, of course, this is an opportunity that Israel shouldn't abandon. Unfortunately, during this crisis, Russia refused any Israeli mediation. For the context, President Zelensky asked twice Prime Minister Bennett to act as a mediator during that crisis. But I think this is also related to the Jewish leitmotif of this war that we can address later.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that. There was a demonstration. I don't know if you saw a demonstration in Israel outside the, I assume outside the Russian embassy, maybe outside the Ukrainian embassy, with people demonstrating basically to the Israeli government, asking for the Israeli government to provide defensive equipment, defensive material, and things for the Ukraine. And one of the signs said something like, I think it was Zelensky tzarich kippah, with this idea that so Zelensky needs a kippah with a double meaning, that he's Jewish, so he needs a kippah, but also kippah in Hebrew also means a dome, meaning the iron dome, which I thought was a clever move. But that plays to what you're saying, that there's this idea, that Israel has this expertise, this particular expertise in defending against missile attacks, and so that's something that perhaps we could really be of help if we so decide to do so, right?
Regarding that point, it's been reported that Israel has been under tremendous pressure by Western officials to provide the Iron Dome system to Ukraine during the first days of the war. It created a very deep dilemma for Israel, not only in terms of balancing its position between Washington and Moscow, but also because Israel does have Israeli citizens living in Ukraine, and you do have a substantial Jewish community. I mean, officially you have 50,000 Jews in Ukraine, but unofficially it goes up to 150,000 or 200,000 Ukrainian Jews. So Israel feels committed, to its principle of saving Jews wherever they live. And after many, many deliberations, and these are very hard calculations, the government refused to provide those defensive capabilities. But here I'm opening a parenthesis, maybe there are some military experts in that room. But in terms of the Iron Dome, I believe that it could protect Ukrainian civilians from Grad missiles and other short-range missiles, but it wouldn't protect them, correct me if I'm wrong, against the newly developed cruise missiles that Russia has bombed Ukrainian population centers with. And even the Ukrainian ambassador to Israel, talked to the government and said that even the Iron Dome could have been limited in terms of protecting the civilians from Russian attacks.
Yeah.
I would like to add to this, Paul, if you would agree that Ukraine, I think it's a miracle, was able to keep its S-300 air defense capabilities almost intact. The Russians were unable to bomb them. This is what they wanted to do in very, very quickly controlling the airspace. They were unable to do that during the first days of the war. So Ukraine did keep those Soviet equipment that are very good against also that type of missiles.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I wonder, I mean, it seems to me that there's sort of an instinctive feeling among many people. I know I feel it, and I think probably many do, that especially when you see what's going on, and you feel like Israel can help in some ways, that we really should. And I think there's definitely there is that instinctive feeling, and people who are should we say influential figures in Israeli society, like Nathan Sharansky, for example, is a good example, who came out and said, that Israel should take a clear moral stand against Putin, which is quite interesting, because he's actually been, generally speaking, before this, Sharansky's been very reluctant to get involved in criticizing the Russian government, because I think he just thinks it's not something he wants to get involved in. So I think that's quite relevant. But I wonder, is there, just to play devil's advocate for nothing else, the argument against Israel getting involved, right? That there's another moral question, which is to say, what about the moral question of preventing Iran from establishing its, some kind of positions in Syria from which it can attack Israel, and for that Israel needs to stay on Russia's good side? Is that a compelling argument?
That's a very good question. The first answer, Paul, is that we're not in 2014, and that Israel understands, I hope it understands, the government, that we are in a new world. And in that new world, the kind of relationship that Israel has had with Russia up to now, this kind of tactical dialogue of deconfliction, needs to be revisited very, very seriously. Because the moral price of this is too high. Is too high, of having Israel being sidelined from the Western consensus. I think it will have serious consequences for Israel. The second element of it is that it is not sure. Even though Russia sent very calming messages to Israel since the beginning of the crisis, official messages that Russia doesn't change its position in Syria, of quote unquote, letting the Israelis do what they do against the Iranians in Syria. But nobody can guarantee that Russia will keep that position.
Yeah.
In a world where Russia is a pariah state, Russia will want to further develop its relations with Syria, with Iran, with China, and maybe even for Russia, keeping that balancing relation between Iran and Israel will become a challenge. It's not sure that Russia itself will be able to keep that position without paying too much of a price vis-à-vis Assad, vis-à-vis the Iranians, and vis-à-vis the Shiite militias in Syria. The second element of it is that the Eastern Mediterranean will change. Since the very beginning of the crisis, we've seen a very dramatic increase of Russia's military presence across the Eastern Mediterranean, with the biggest presence of naval ships, of warships in the Eastern Mediterranean since the end of the Cold War. And with Minister Shoigu, the defense minister, visiting Syria on February 15th, just a few days before the invasion, just to project power from Syria against NATO. So I believe that this crisis will bring fire and smoke to the Eastern Mediterranean region, with a strengthened Russian posture in Syria and a strengthened power projection of NATO across the Eastern Mediterranean. And we'll see Israel in between. And here, Israel at the operational level will, I'm sure, deal with new difficulties of how manage incidents, conflicts between, for example, an increased NATO presence and a more determined or more aggressive Russian presence in that area. Just both for the context, in the wake of that crisis, Israel has observed very disturbing elements. For example, new Syrian Russian patrolling activities, GPS jamming affecting the well-functioning of the Ben Gurion airport. We've seen a lot of disturbing Russian activities targeting NATO and the US, but also affecting Israeli activities and Israeli military activities in that area.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the extent of the Syrian-Russian fraternal relationship is such that it's interesting that the resolution that we mentioned earlier that was voted on today in the General Assembly, calling on Russia to withdraw. Russia and 4 other countries voted against. One of them was Syria, and the others, by the way, were North Korea, Belarus, and Eritrea. So judge a man by his friends. Okay, let's go to the point that we hinted at earlier, which is that the unusual Jewish element to this, which is, of course, that Ukraine's president Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. How do you see that playing into Israel's calculations, and also perhaps the way that the wider Jewish world, which is also represented in this audience, of course, might sort of view this conflict?
Yeah, I don't mean to be Judeo-centric, but I have to admit.
Go for it.
I have to admit that the Jewish element, the Jewish leitmotif theme is extremely, extremely salient. First of all, you have a president, the Russian president, who presents himself as a Philosemite and who wants to liberate Ukraine from fascist, Nazi, anti-Semitic elements by precipitating the fall of a Nazi Jewish president. So this is a very bizarre ideological context. On the other hand, you have a Jewish president, Zelensky, the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, who is openly Jewish, who is a Russian speaker, and who calls on Israel a few times to provide help. And today, on his Twitter account, called all the Jews of the world in Hebrew to not stay silent, and invoking the bombing of the Babi Yar massacre site in the outskirts of Kiev. According to him, Babi Yar was affected by Russian bombardments yesterday. In parentheses, it appears as untrue. The Israeli journalist Ron Ben-Ishai documented that today, that Babi Yar, thank God, was not affected, was not destroyed as a site. And invoking the destruction of Oman. Oman is the pilgrimage site, of Chassidut, of Hasidism. Yeah. And basically Zelensky is saying to Israel and to the Jews of the world, Russia is destroying Jewish memory, Jewish symbols, and potentially Jewish lives on the Ukrainian front lines. And you do have a moral obligation to not stay silent and to press your government to act. He also, very interestingly, the Jewish Ukrainian establishment, and especially Jewish rabbis and the chief rabbi of Ukraine, addressed the Jewish Russian establishment and Russian Jews to put pressure on Putin to stop his operation that is meant to denazify a country ruled by a Jewish Nazi. So it sounds like a surreal Jewish story in which Israel is as a magnet attracted by Jews and Nazi hunters on all sides. Add to this that Israel was born in Ukraine. The founders of Zionism were born in Ukraine, they were born in Odessa, they were born in Belarus, they were Russian speakers. So, and Israel is a country where you have 1 million of Russian speakers, a third of them from Ukraine with families. So there is a very strong element, a Jewish element in that war, a very emotional one, a very disturbing one. And that forces Israel to take a clearer stance. And here I would speak as an Israeli citizen, not as an analyst. I have a deep conviction that Israel shouldn't miss that historical moment and should really, really have a clear stance regarding this question and be more active vis-à-vis Ukraine. This is my position, and I believe that regarding the freedom of operation of the IDF in Syria, I believe that Israel should take that risk, given the fact that Russia might change its position, and that the whole security architecture in that region could very rapidly change.
Okay, thank you very much. That's there's a lot there for us. Before I go to questions, I'm going to go to questions in a second, so keep writing them in. We've already had a few. One last question from me, because I don't want to ignore the issue of the wider Middle East, because it's not just Israel. There's also other countries in the Middle East that are allies of the United States, but nevertheless have strategic relations with Russia for various reasons. I think Egypt, the UAE, Turkey, of course. How can you say something about the considerations that the leaders of those countries are dealing with?
Yeah, I'll go very, very quickly, and you're welcome to delve into those questions, during the Q&A and the dialogue that we're going to have. First of all, these countries deal with a major problem, which is the US disengagement or perceived disengagement from that area. And the sense, and I think it's been accentuated by the war in Ukraine, the fear of the US abandonment. So those countries have increasingly developed economic but also security ties with Russia at the benefit of Russia, for Russia's benefit, since Putin's policy of grand return to the Middle East, let's say since the early 2000s. For example, Turkey, which is the most valuable NATO ally of the United States in that region, has very strong security relationships with the United States as a NATO member, but has developed a very complex, a very contradictory relation with Russia, oscillating between crisis and rapprochement. Yes. So Turkey is striving to keep a neutral stance between Russia and Ukraine. It has a very strong defense cooperation with Ukraine. And by the way, I have to say that the Turkish drones, the drones that Turkey provided to Ukraine, as it did to Azerbaijan in 2020, did an excellent job in the Ukrainian front lines. At the same time, Ukraine decided to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to naval warships. It has the right to do so according to the Montreux Convention of 1936. And after many pressures, Turkey closed that strait, basically blocking Russian naval warships from leaving the Black Sea, but enabling them to coming back to their naval bases. So Turkey is also having many dilemmas and many opportunities as well. Turkey is using that crisis to facilitate a rapprochement with the United States, but also with Israel. Turkey is interested in developing its relations with Israel. We have many signs of that desire in the last weeks. Egypt, of course, sees the United States as the bedrock of its security. It does have a peace agreement with Israel, but Egypt has developed a very close security relationship with Russia, a very close energy relationship with Russia in the past years. So Egypt also is having that kind of wavering position. Egypt wants to use that crisis as an opportunity to boost its energy, natural gas exports to Europe, hoping for a natural gas crisis. And here Egypt's position could be upgraded as a natural gas provider. And the most important actors are the Gulf states. The Gulf states, of course, that are wavering between the United States and Russia, with Russia as part of the OPEC plus agreement or cartel of countries trying to stabilize the oil prices. And I think, Paul, we're going to take this in the Q&A session. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar are having difficulties of balancing between Washington and Moscow, given their primary energy interest in that crisis.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, we can definitely return to that issue. Right, let's go to questions. As I said, I've already had several. Please do keep writing them in as they occur to you. Let's start with this from Fern Rice. She wants to know what are your thoughts on the pressure that's reportedly being applied to Israel to take non-Jewish Ukrainian refugees?
I think, first of all, I've seen that in the press. I don't know if these are true, authentic reports or not. I just don't know.
Right.
I think the only thing that I can tell is that Israel took the initiative of not deporting illegal Ukrainian workers in Israel. We have a lot of Ukrainian workers, working as in restaurants or as cleaners in Israel. And so Israel took the initiative of not deporting them. And I've seen other Middle East countries that decided to close their doors to Ukrainian refugees. Just today, the United Arab Emirates announced that it was canceling a memorandum of a visa-free regime with Ukraine. So I believe there is a fear of seeing refugee flows to the Middle East, and I believe it's connected to the trauma of having the trauma of Syrian refugees, living in Lebanon, living in Jordan, living in other countries. I think there is a fear of that. So I'm sorry, I cannot comment more because I haven't heard official reports about this.
Okay, no problem. I just to clarify something. Sandra asked about the strike on the Baba Yar memorial. She says that Rabbi Nachum Ehrentrau was in a train heading to Hungary with with Jews on board, and he said that it was hit. What can you tell us about that? I've heard that actually the memorial itself was not hit; it was something close by.
Yeah, there are conflicting reports, and this is the problem with this war, which I think it's the first war in world history that is so disturbing in the sense that it is so transparent. You have so many videos all the time being posted. What happened is that the Russians bombed yesterday the main television cable tower of Kiev, which is located nearby the huge site of Babi Yar, where more than 150,000 civilians were killed. Most of them were Jews in September 1941. And there were reports that Babi Yar immediately was destroyed. And yesterday, this news circulated all over the world, and especially in the Israeli press. And today, Ron Benishai, who is, I think, the only Israeli correspondent in Kiev at the moment. He's a veteran journalist, a very serious journalist, did a very in-depth study of this question. And today he was in Babi Yar, and actually he showed that Babi Yar has not been destroyed. And this contradicts President Zelensky's today tweet in Hebrew that argued that Babi Yar was destroyed and therefore Jews should rally all over the world. You know, like the war in Spain in the 1930s, there should be this international mobilization of good people to fight the forces of evil. And apparently this news is fake. So this is very confusing. And I think this is also one of the difficulties of Israel and other actors, is that they're dealing with a war that is very confusing and that develops at a crazy pace. The rhythm of that war is just unbearable. It's very, very difficult to follow what is going on at the operational level, especially given the amount of information from satellites, from the Ukrainian forces, from the Russian forces, from civilians. It's difficult to build a real picture, a reliable picture.
Okay, I'm not sure how much people on this call, on this event, know about what's happened in Ukraine in the past sort of 20 years, and the change of government after the so-called the Maidan revolution, and the removal of basically a Putin puppet government. You can tell me if that's a fair description of the government that was ousted. But certainly, I think some people there's differing views about the nature of the regime of the regime that took over after that. And there was, I think, at least some feeling that there were far-right elements involved. This was certainly Putin's accusation, right? That there were far-right elements, even neo-Nazi elements involved in the Ukrainian nationalist government that replaced the pro-Russian government. And we have one question from Shmuel Yerushalmi, who clearly is someone who sees the Ukrainian government in that way. He refers to a pro-Nazi and pro-Nazi collaborators regime in Ukraine since February 2014. That's how he puts it. Now, I want to give people the opportunity to give their opinion, so I'm putting it out there. It's not a position I share, but I want to give Shmuel the opportunity to have you respond to that. And can you just tell us, how do you see the government in Ukraine since 2014, the change in government, what it represents, and I guess specifically how you would respond to that depiction of the regime?
So first of all, we should make a very clear distinction between the Russian narrative and the Russian propaganda on Ukraine and the reality of Ukrainian political life. Ukrainian political life is extremely complex and is informed by an extremely complex and contradictory past, in which the Ukrainian nationalism and the effort of the Ukrainian nation building and state building is undoubtedly stained by a very heavy past of collaborationist nationalism under the banner of Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukhevich. And of course, the OUN troops during World War II and up until the 1950s, and the Soviets fought them. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, those elements that had been repressed during the Soviet period came back, bounced back, with an effort, especially under President Poroshenko and under President Yushchenko, more under Yushchenko than under Poroshenko. Yushchenko before the Orange Revolution of providing a full and I would legitimacy to the rehabilitation of those fascist, nationalist, anti-Semitic, collaborationist elements, with Yushchenko providing the medal of Hero of Ukraine to Bandera and Shukhevich, who was the head of the Nachtigall factions that directly collaborated with the Nazis and directly participated in the extermination of the 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews. Certainly that element was extremely prevalent until Yanukovych came to power. Yanukovych balanced that back. And after the Maidan revolution of 2014, we had the two forces of civil, liberal political parties against those nationalist, I would say, Nazifying elements. So this is a true element of Ukrainian political life. And I would say this is, I'm a believer, and I would say that this is a miracle that Ukraine now is having a Jewish president. And you know, for a certain period, Ukraine was the only country in the world with Israel that had a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. And I believe it is very ironic for a country whose nationalism has been so tainted by this collaborationist past. Right. On the other hand, Paul, and just to finish that thought, the fact that Putin framed that war as a denazification war, I think it created a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that this is Putin's major success, that for the world, including for Israel, Ukraine will not be seen anymore through the prism of its dark past. I think the heroism of the Jewish president sort of cleanses that problematic past, for the good or for bad. I mean, I don't think it's good, because in a way it will whitewash Ukraine and its nationalism too easily, but this is very clearly creating that kind of effect.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question here from Uri Hirsch. He asks, what do you know about the report that many Russian soldiers are unhappy at having been conscripted into this war and are even sabotaging Russian vehicle gas tanks so that they run out of gas and can't move into Kiev?
Yeah. First of all, it is based on multiple videos of Russian captives who were interrogated by Ukrainian soldiers. And Uri, what we've heard from those witnesses is that, first of all, they had no ideas that they were about to invade Ukraine. They were called up for an exercise, for a military exercise, so they were not prepared. And second, this is true that we've seen tanks and armored vehicles that were abandoned in Ukraine by Russian soldiers. So it sort of suggested to many military experts that there was some level of defection among Russian troops, a very low morale. It is not, we're not seeing a very mobilized Russian army. It's a very uncoordinated. And I have to say that we're seeing signs of anxiety among the Russian military leadership that tries to cover up the Russian casualties. Up to now, according to Ukrainian sources, 5,300 Russian soldiers have been killed, According to Russian forces, today is the first day when they officially recognized it. 500 soldiers were killed. This is more casualties than Russian casualties in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2007. This is a lot of casualties. And so they're trying to cover up the corpses up to the point that they're bringing portable crematorium to Ukraine to burn the corpses to avoid another Afghanistan effect. You know, what precipitated the fall of the Soviet Union was the vision of Soviet soldiers coming back without legs or in coffins from Afghanistan.
Right. Right.
So Putin is very well aware of that effect. So definitely we're seeing a low morale, a low level of organization, and some signs of potential defection.
Okay, thank you. The question here, I think this is an interesting one. Why did Putin decide to invade? Or let's put it this way, if she'll allow me to rephrase the question slightly. The timing of the invasion, how much is it to do with the fact that Biden is in the White House and not Trump? Because I've heard, this is Isabel Margaret, her question, because there's a debate going on. Obviously, everything in American politics these days becomes part of the partisanship in America. But you know, there's this debate going on in America right now that I see on social media between people saying, on the one hand, Trump supporters saying this would never have happened under Trump. Trump was this sort of unpredictable president, that sort of chaos theory president that's kind of would have scared Putin out of doing this, and he's doing it now because Biden is seen as much more weak than Trump. And then on the other hand, there's people on the Democratic side who say, well, you know, Trump was the guy who you know, openly praised Putin, who tried to tie aid to Ukraine to Ukraine getting some dirt on Joe Biden. That would be the last guy we would want to have in the White House right now. So how do you view that? What do you think is in, if it's possible to read the mind of someone like Vladimir Putin? Like, how much does the occupant of the White House play into the timing of this invasion?
Well, that's a very, very good question. First of all, the identity of the American president is one factor in a very complex constellation of causes and conditions that may have precipitated that invasion at that time. Regarding Trump or Biden, I would say that it didn't enter the Russian calculus in that sense, that if you go beyond the style and the rhetorical level, in terms of deterrence posture, there is no change of policy between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in terms of strengthening NATO's in its eastern flank. The United States policy has been consistent in terms of disengaging from the Middle East. The US administrations, the two administrations have followed the same line since President Obama. So in terms of deterrence posture, I don't see any major rupture that could have invited Russia to, to feel free to make an invasion at the moment. There is one that I could see is that may have affected the timing is the midterm elections. That Putin knows, Biden's liabilities, constraints, knows in what kind of political atmosphere Biden is operating, and the economic constraints that Biden has, the inflation rising, the ology of deploying troops, the shock of Afghanistan that has created. I think it's more in that direction if it played out. Because again, I think that we will need 10 years at least to understand what precipitated that invasion. It's a multi-causal event, an extremely complex one that I believe is also related to the emotional and the psychiatric state of President Putin himself. And among those who believe that Putin has changed and that he's not operating under the same rational calculations that he used to operate by a few years ago. So this is also something to take into account. I think that the fact that we're in the middle of the winter played a huge role in terms of Russia maintaining its energy weapon against Europe, but it's a very, very, very complex event. I think we're underestimating the gravity of this event and the ways in which it will affect our countries, our democracies, and our lives in the decade to come. I think this is one of these big turning points of the 20th and 21st century. It will affect the alliances building, it will affect our democracies, it will affect the ways in which we think about arms control, territorial integrity. It's a revolutionary event. And I think that Trump or Biden is a secondary question in terms of the Russian calculus.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here, which is, I guess, also about the Russian calculus. It's specifically about Putin, and there are various ways that this kind of question could be phrased, but I think Robin puts it as bluntly, but as legitimately as it could be put. So I'm just going to read it out. She says, do you think Putin is a complete megalomaniac who does not care about the consequences to his own country? How would you assess that?
First of all, I love the question. It's a very legitimate question. Putin is a very complex figure. And Putin crystallized in him, he merges several strategic cultures. You have Putin the imperialist, and Putin who is ready to sacrifice human lives and the well-being of his people for the grandiose idea of restoring Russia's imperial existence. So the end justifies the means. So you have Putin in this line of Peter the Great, Catherine II, restoring Russia's imperial might. You have Putin, I'm sorry for the expression, but Hitler. You have Putin the revisionist, Putin taking revenge against the world order and acting a little bit like Hitler in the late 1930s and sort of testing the Western resolve to recreate and change the lines of the world security architecture. You have Putin the mystic, Putin who is a believer, who is being supported by the patriarch. There is a fascinating book by a colleague, Dima Adamski, who wrote about the Russian Orthodox Church influence on Russian nuclear posture and on Russian nuclear sector. So this is fascinating. So Putin the mystic and believing that Ukraine and Russia should be reunited because Russia needs to recreate the third Rome and be the beacon of Eastern Christendom. And you have Putin, the petty KGB agent, who doesn't care about any rules, who doesn't care about lying to people, openly lying on your face to Trump and Macron and Schulz and the entire world, and that conducts Russia from one special operation to another special operation, even if it means putting the world, on the verge of Third World War, on the brinkmanship. And you have Putin, the psychiatrically disbalanced person. Putin has lived in a bunker for 2 years now. Putin was isolated from the entire world for 2 years. He doesn't read internet. He doesn't have access to any alternative sources of information. He's surrounded by yes guys, as Paul, pointed to me today very rightly. And Putin has spent his entire life to choose people because they can be manipulated. And this is exactly what his chief of staff looks like, his defense minister looks like, his foreign minister looks like. So in the very inner circle, you don't have any voice who could challenge the plan, the narrative, the vision. And that it's a mixture that is extremely dangerous for the world. The imperialist, the mystic, the KGB agent, and the Hitler-type revisionist actor. And all of this together, I think he presents an existential danger for the world. He needs to be stopped.
So, okay. So thank you very much for that very full answer to the question. We're at the end of the hour, and I think we'll end with a question which may be on a lot of people's minds. And I'm asking it fearing that it may not give us a particularly optimistic end to this evening, but nevertheless, I think it's an important question, which is Fern Rice asks if you could speculate on the likely end game.
No, I can't. What my fear is that because of Russia's inability to lead a blitzkrieg conventional war, a clean war with very clear successes. For example, the partition of Ukraine between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine with a pro-Russian government. I think that now we're already seeing this. It's not that I'm observing, like you observe. We're transitioning to this kind of Chechen scenario of precipitating a defeat, a capitulation at every cost, And the cost is full repression in the Russian Federation, full economic collapse in the Russian Federation. Putin said to his finance minister, $1 doesn't worth 1,000 years of Russian history. This is what he said to him 2 days ago. Yeah. And very, very tragically, more civilian lives to be lost in Ukraine. And I mean, this is an extremely difficult situation to observe. I think this is one of the worst crises that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, maybe except from the war in Yugoslavia, when you have this kind of powerlessness of the world in front of the orange mechanic that is unfolding under our eyes. I will just finish with one thing, that if there is one thing that we've learned from this crisis is, first of all, even US allies and distant allies can find themselves very lonely in times of crisis. What is happening in Ukraine may happen some in Israel. Second, that the US and Western policy of disconnecting the economic sanctions from the credible use of force, from a strengthened deterrence posture, I think is a tragic failure of the West. I'm convinced that should the US have posited an ultimatum to Putin at the very beginning, and NATO forces as well, it would have ended within 2 days. This is my personal conviction. Maybe I'm wrong. But I think that this uncoupling of economic sanctions from the use of force and this increased reluctance to resorting to force might create other tragedies, not only in Ukraine, but in other places in the world, including in our turbulent region in the Middle East.
Okay, Sarah-Masha Fainberg, thank you very, very much for your time and for your insights and for your expertise and for enlightening us and educating us, not cheering us up, I have to say, but unfortunately, we only need to look at what's going on to know that this isn't really the sort of situation where there is a particularly cheery approach that one can take, I think. But yeah, but there's a lot of nice comments coming through, appreciating what you've given us this evening, Sarah. So I want to pass that on.
To finish on a positive note.
Oh, let's do that.
Yeah, Paul, would you agree that we didn't have for a long time a real Jewish hero? And now we have a real Jewish hero. His name is Zelensky. He's the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. And I think the Jewish people really needed to have some kind of Jewish hero. So that's the positive note.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that.
For young Jewish children, at least they will have a hero to identify to.
Excellent. Okay, well, everyone, wherever you are in the world, I wish you a good evening or rest of the day, depending where you are. Check out our website and our Facebook page for continued updates on what we're doing here. Email me if you're not on my mailing list and you would like to be, and you would like to get the details of our events. You can email me at paulgross@begincentre.org.il. Sorry, not Paul Gross, sorry, Paul G @begincentre.org.il. So email me and I will add you to the list, and you will find out more about what we're doing. I do want to say that in about 10 days time, Sunday, the 13th of March and the 14th of March, we have a special symposium here at the Begin Center for the 30th anniversary of the passing of Menachem Begin, the 30th yahrzeit of Menachem Begin. And we have in person, actually at the Begin Center, for those of you in Jerusalem, come to our website, go to our website and sign up for that. Or you can go to the website and sign up to watch it virtually. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks again to Sarah-Masha Fainberg, and stay safe, everyone. Bye.